So one thing that I think that's really interesting about the modernist poets is the way in which they draw attention to how women who at this time in history were not serving on the forces and were not actually politicians were actually implicated in war efforts. And what's also really interesting about Pauline Barrington's education is that, on the surface, the poem is very explicitly a um, an indictment of how women who are staying at home taking care of their children allow them to play in war games that seem fun or innocent in the time, but then later when they're older, become lethal. And also at the same time, there's a subtext about a critique of how women are asked to support war efforts by providing clothing for the soldiers, and that production of the clothing is produced simultaneously as they're allowing their children to play war games. And so, it's deeply ironic that what the women are being asked to do in order to support the war effort is to produce clothing for the soldiers, and there is a lot of nobility, right, that is being asked of the women, saying, hey, there are soldiers out there that need your help, please help them. And they're helping them while also educating the next generation in order to go and fight in the war and potentially die. And so we also see here an allusion to Wordsworth's Ode, Intimations of Immortality, which we studied earlier in the semester. And the allusion is to the lines, "The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety." And we see that here, where the line, "If the child is father of the man, is the toy gun father of Krupps." Now, Krupp, in order to understand this line, you need to know that Krupp is a German company that produced all of the Germans' artillery. And that included all of the siege guns that were used in World War I. And so this poem is really explicitly making women culpable in the production of warfare, which, again, is something that is or would have been really shocking during the time period, because women were seen as not being part of government or politics or, warfare or soldiers. And so how are they culpable? And the way that they're culpable, according to Pauline Barrington, is that they allow their children to play in games that then encourages them to serve in what was essentially seen by the modernists as death wars, which is, I guess, the definition of war. So a couple of allusions, again, that you need to be aware of in order to understand the poems from this week is Big Bertha is the artillery gun that was on the left. And then there's also the Paris gun that you see here pictured on the right. And these were military ammunitions that were new in World War I and were incredibly terrifying in their ability to produce massive death very quickly. So just to give you a little bit of background there, before we go on to Wilfred Owen, who was born in the year 1893 and died far too young in the year 1918. He volunteered to serve in the military in the year 1915, and he served on the front lines and was a first person, eyewitness to the gas attacks that were so new and unfamiliar to persons in the modernist era. He fought in France during World War One, and he fought during the worst winter of war that the military endured. He was injured and suffered from what they called shell shock. Back then, we would now call that PTSD. And one of the things that when he was, being hospitalized during his injury is that he was encouraged to write poetry in order to deal with his emotions. And so the poetry that we have is an artifact of I guess what you could call like the earliest sort of movements in the West in order to help people sort of like talk through their pain, because he obviously was really traumatized by what he witnessed on the battlefield. So after he was injured in 1917, he did return to battle. And on November 4th, 1918, he was shot and killed on the battlefield. So it was November 11th of 1918, only 7 days later, when the news reached his parents that that he had been killed. And as his parents, the way the story goes, as his parents received this news, the armistice bells were ringing. And what armistice means is that the end of war had been declared. So, there's again this like terrible tragedy that he was injured, was traumatized by war. He returned to war because he was, trying to be a good soldier and to serve his country. And he died just one mere week before the end of war was declared. And again, this possibly apocryphal tale that the news of his death reached his parents as the armistice bells were ringing. So Wilfred Owen's war poetry reflects an incredible disillusion of patriotism and optimism that was kind of sweeping through the British public by the end of World War One. And in one of his letters to his parents, and I'm going to adjust the screen here, he said, "The people of England needn't hope, they must agitate." And of course, here we have a picture of possibly what it was that was causing Wilfred Owen to ask that. So, the World War One poets, as they are known, and this was a movement within British literature history, is recognized in Westminster Abbey. And Westminster Abbey is this incredibly important church cathedral in British history where people of note are buried. And usually it's politicians or authors or, government leaders. But what they did in Westminster Abbey, what the government did, is that they said, we're going to actually dedicate a portion of this mausoleum to the World War One poets. And there are dozens of World War One poets buried there. And what Wilfred Owen's tombstone says is, "My subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity." So there are 16 great war poets with the names of the poets inscribed on it. And in addition is the inscription that we have here from Owen's preface. And it was unveiled on November 11th, 1985, which was the 67th anniversary of Armistice. And his most famous poem is Anthem for Doomed Youth, Doomed Youth. And it's one of his two most famous poems. And here we have a passage from that poem that says, "Oh, passing bells for these who die as cattle, only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires." And what you see here in his poetry is, again, this binary that's being contrasted between the religious call, I guess you could say, for war in the name of religion, and then also the horror of what actually happens on the battlefields. And so we see the passing bells, that makes one think of Christian a bell service, but then that's contrasted with the monstrous anger of the guns. And then we have the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle, which is then again immediately contrasted with the hasty orisons, which again is a Christian song. And then immediately, no prayers nor bells, the choirs, the demented choirs, which makes you think of Christian singing, that's then put immediately against the wailing shells and the bugles, which of course brings to mind the bugle players of military choirs, and the fact that they are playing for the sad shires, in other words, for all of the men who have died in battlefield. And so you can see that a large part of his artistry is taking what, again, was so important for the Modernists to put a clear and discrete contrast between what our ideology asks us to do, and then the reality of what happens when you follow that call. So this is what the modernist poets, the war poets, are known for, is this clear and very distinct critique of culture, and specifically of British culture, that in so many different ways says war is good, and then you go to war and you find out that it's awful. So the poem that he's most known for is this one. It's called Dulce et Decorum Est, and that is Latin for "Sweet and fitting it is to die for your fatherland." And again, I'm going to repeat that. "Sweet and fitting it is to die for your fatherland." And that's the Latin translation, the English translation of the Latin of the name of this poem. And I am going to stop this video now and finish up my lecture in the next video, and also let you know what your assignment is for this week.